And there has been, I think, a general loss of political momentum because of an absence, most recently, of global leadership, particularly since President Obama departed the stage. I'd say, however, in our own defence, that my government brought in a renewable energy target for 20% of Australian electricity supply by renewable energy by 2020. That's on track. We put solar panels on a bucket load of Australian roofs, probably 1/5 of the housing stock. That's done. And our legislation for a carbon price was repealed by the Conservatives. Not much we could do about that. So we've sought to put our best foot forward, but you're right to say, Patricia, globally, it's a relatively grim picture.
Overnight, climate activist Greta Thunberg gave a blistering speech to world leaders. She said they had stolen the future and condemned their fairy tales of endless economic growth. What did you make of her speech?
I think she represents the anger of that generation and does so effectively. It might insult a whole lot of middle-aged white guys because it's not the way in which we would talk, or we think that it's inappropriate for a young girl to speak that way. But when I speak to young people around the world, whether it's in China, here in the United States, back home in Australia, frankly, there is a rising rage that our generation has failed to step up to the plate. And most acutely, we've seen this, of course, in Australia through the Abbott government, through the Turnbull government, through the Morrison government. In fact, Prime Minister Morrison couldn't even be bothered to make it to New York today to deliver his speech on enhanced Australian commitments against our global climate change responsibilities.
You're right, the Prime Minister didn't hear Greta's speech. He was in Chicago. Scott Morrison is attending the General Assembly, but not the Climate Summit. Foreign Minister Marise Payne went in his place. We have got representation there. Why isn't that enough?
Because this is a global challenge requiring global leadership and national leadership. I mean, Australian corporates are not dumb. They understand that in Canberra at the moment we have a government which is not serious about climate change action. So they will try and get away with blue murder, or they will take independent action of their own to make a contribution. And so when you have a Prime Minister of the country not stepping up to the plate, addressing the world's forum and indicating what Australia's future carbon reduction commitments will be, it sends a very clarion clear message both to the Australian domestic corporate community and to the international community that the Australian government is just not serious. We're actually free riding on the rest of the world. I believe it's unacceptable, and I stand by everything I said a decade ago this week in the UN General Assembly when I described it as the great moral and economic challenge of our age.
Scott Morrison has called on China to do more. China is one of the world's biggest polluters, but under the Paris Agreement, they don't have to reduce emissions until 2030. Should they do more?
Well, I constantly say to our Chinese friends, the world expects you to do more because you're now the world's largest polluter. Against that, the industrial world, including Australia and led by the United States, has contributed the biggest slab of greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere over the last half century or more. So therefore, there is a set of shared responsibilities. You know, I've had many disagreements with Chinese leaders over their climate change efforts, most spectacularly in Copenhagen in 2009. Since then, the Chinese position has turned around. 2015, they actually signed on, agreed to forward commitments. But should they be doing more? Of course they should be doing more. But Australia cannot use that as its excuse to simply be missing in action. This, by Prime Minister Morrison, is a dereliction of duty, given his responsibilities to our farmers, to the droughted areas of Australia, to those suffering from extreme weather events, and to the next generation of Australian kids for whom Greta Thunberg has acted as a clarion clear call for the future.
So in that sense, you do have sympathy for that argument that the Prime Minister is making about China doing more?
Well, I start from where China was a decade ago, which was China wasn't even on board with the science fully back in Copenhagen when I took them on directly. But you see this change in the evolution in China's position, signing on to Paris, agreeing to a set of forward commitments, and probably, if you look at the data, reaching those commitments ahead of time. But let me explain one reason why I think China could be doing more, but so far is not. The withdrawal from the stage of American global climate change leadership. Until recently, America has been the largest polluter in the world for decade after decade, only to be supplanted by China most recently. But when you have President Trump basically saying climate change, schmimate change, we're not even faintly interested in it, it carries a reverberation across so many other countries, including China, taking the pressure off them to act. So if I was Prime Minister Morrison in his most recent meetings in the White House, I would have been saying to President Trump, listen, Donald, the bottom line is this is a shared planet and we need America to step up and to resume global leadership. But I bet Prime Minister Morrison chose to remain silent because he didn't want to offend his American guest. So you ask why China is not doing as much as it could, and in my judgment should, the American pressure has turned right off.